Chapter 16, The Uncharted Road. Little Raymond, dressed in a blue velvet suit, his face washed and his hair combed, stepped into the dining room and looked furtively about. The table, with the electric chandelier hanging over it, the walls covered in part with green cloth, in part hung with pictures, the steam radiators hissing and puffing, all interested and puzzled his childish imagination. They were also new. The woman who a short time earlier had washed and dressed him was flitting back and forth between the dining room and the kitchen. She was setting the table. Every time she passed, she smiled at him or tapped him on the head playfully. Little Raymond liked the woman, but she was not his mother, and he was wondering how soon his mother would come. Presently there was a ring, and he ran into the hall. Two women came in. His mother was not among them. One of the women said hello to him indifferently, as if he were a grown person. The other lifted him up to her face, gazed at him pleasantly, and kissed his cheek. He was looking at her heavy, black-rimmed spectacles. Behind the glasses, the woman had eyes just like everyone else, and he was wondering why she covered them with such strange things. The woman was talking to him in baby language, which he had already outgrown, and he was not listening to her. There was another ring. Little Raymond gave a leap, and had not the woman tightened her arms about him, he would have fallen to the floor. She went into the hall with him. It was his mother. The young woman surrendered him to Hilda, and he clamped his arms about his mother's neck as if he had just saved himself from great danger. There were more rings at the door. More women came, but Raymond paid no attention to them now. He had his mother. That was all he needed. The young women went each to her room, and he and his mother went into their room. His mother changed her clothes and was fixing her hair before the mirror. He wondered why she was doing this and who the woman was who had dressed him and was now cooking their supper in the kitchen. He met the young women, including the one with the spectacles, who had held him in her arms, at the table. Between this young woman and his mother, a place had been made for him, and he was sitting in a nice new high chair. The woman who had dressed and washed him and who had been cooking their dinner now served the meal. He was served. His mother, too, was served. He meant to ask her about this, but there were many things to ask about, and the questions were crowding on each other. Besides, there were so many strange people at the table, and he was shy. It was just as well little Raymond did not embarrass his mother with questions. Hilda was busy with her own thoughts. The change in her surroundings was as strange and puzzling to her as it was to the child, though from a different angle. Like everything else in her life, both good and bad, it came with unlooked-for suddenness. She was asked one day at the office for her telephone number. She had none and was advised to change her residence. It was important that one should be able to reach her over the phone. Several other young women, it turned out, had no telephones. One of these was Molly Evans, a Denver girl, who was always brimming over with exuberance and plans. Miss Evans came out with an idea: a cooperative apartment. A chum of Miss Evans, Norma Heath, although she was not with the shop safety committee and had a telephone, joined in the project. There were 4 of them. They needed 5, and Molly Evans determined upon Hilda as the 5th. Hilda recoiled from the suggestion. She had become accustomed to the privacy of her 2 rooms, felt safe in them. The prospect of being thrown together with other people frightened her, especially such people as Molly Evans and her friends. They came from wealthy homes and had all been to college. The places they lived in on Washington Square they called studios. They carried books with them most of the time, a volume of Shaw, Dunsany, Galsworthy. None of them lived on their earnings. They were getting allowances from home. She made excuses. She would probably not be a desirable tenant. She had a child, and a child gave a good deal of trouble in a house. Molly Evans dismissed most of Hilda's objections as irrelevant. As for the child, far from being a drawback, he was an asset in Miss Evans' eyes. She beamed with enthusiasm at the thought of having a child in their midst. It was just what they needed to make the place a real home. And they needed Mrs. Thorson. They needed her practical knowledge of the working people. All they knew of the labor movement was what they had got from books, what the professor had told them in college. Mrs. Thorson, on the other hand, was directly connected with the masses. It would be selfish of her not to share her experience with them. There seemed to be no way out. Besides, finding a proper place for herself and the child was no easy matter for Hilda. And Miss Evans and the girls were really considerate. There were several day nurseries for the children of professional working women in the Washington Square district. They would look for a flat in the proximity of one of these nurseries. Hilda agreed, and within a month, the cooperative home came into being. It was a 6-room flat just off Washington Square and was but 8 or 10 minutes' walk from their place of work. Miss Evans sponsored the idea of taking in a woman to keep house for them. Their lunches and dinners at home would more than pay the cost of maintaining a housekeeper. Miss Heath was an enthusiastic second, and a housekeeper was hired. This was the first Saturday evening in the new menage, their first state dinner, as Miss Evans called it. It was to be followed by a party later in the evening to which the girls had invited some of their friends. The girls praised the cooking, and all together they agreed that the dinner made them feel very much like home. To Hilda, however, the taste of the dinner was lost in troubled reflections. It was hard for her to harmonize her old self with her new surroundings, to reconcile her socialist principles with the distinctly bourgeois flavor of the place. She was being served, she who believed in no servants. Whither was it leading? Where would it end? "You look tired, Mrs. Thorson. You must have had a hard day," Miss Heath spoke up. It was Miss Heath who wore the black-rimmed glasses that had so greatly interested and perplexed little Raymond. Hilda gave an affirmative nod. She was glad Miss Heath's question carried its own answer. She wasn't in the mood to talk just then. But Martha Wagner, another of the girls who shared in the cooperative experiment, was. Miss Wagner hailed from Cincinnati. She boasted of revolutionary traditions, her grandfather having participated in the German Revolution of 1848. Miss Wagner plunged into a vivid description of her day's experiences. She had visited 16 factories in all. In more than half of them, the aisles to the fire escapes were blocked. She had had a time of it with some of the manufacturers before she convinced them that all exits must be cleared and must stay clear and accessible at all times. "I never knew I had feet until today," Miss Wagner concluded. "Today, my feet seem to be 99% of me." Harriet Adams, the last girl in the group, followed with an account of her experiences. Miss Adams was the daughter of a rich leather manufacturer in St. Louis. Upon graduating from college 3 years earlier, she had come to New York with the intention of embarking upon a literary and artistic career. She had practiced verse writing in college and knew something about illustrating. Her illustrating she discarded early. She could do nothing with it. To versification, Miss Adams clung and had some half-dozen of her poems printed. In the meantime, she had become interested in socialism, the labor movement, and woman suffrage. She took the job of factory inspector for the experience that was in it, the things it might lead up to, as she put it. Her story was cut short by a ring at the door. A young man in a sweater and without a hat entered. He was an architect living on the floor below. Villard Spence was his name. Several other young men and one young woman came within the next half hour. The woman was Florence Meade, a California girl. She was short and stocky, with blue eyes and large lashes that were always drooping as if she were forever listening to someone declaring himself in love to her. Of the men, Stephen Young was an artist. Cliff Gordon was the editor of a labor news syndicate, and Herbert Carston, a man of 30, with an intelligent but none too energetic face, was the secretary of an organization whose object it was to promote manual training among colored children. It was time for little Raymond to be sleeping, and Hilda excused herself and left the room. When she came back, the entire company was cozily ensconced in chairs, sofas, settees. Miss Heath was serving Russian tea in glasses and with lemon. Miss Adams and Mr. Carson made room for Hilda on a couch beside them. The conversation was animated. They talked of Bernard Shaw, Sidney Webb, and Havelock Ellis, socialism, individualism, free love, the right to one's convictions, to do as one pleased, to live as one saw fit. Miss Adams slipped her hand through Hilda's arm, leaned against her shoulder, and sat listening. Hilda, too, listened. She was thinking of Hillstrom. What would he say to her new associations? What would he have thought about the conversation? He had visited her a number of times that summer, and never once had the question of free love come up in their talks. She was drawing a comparison between Hillstrom and these men. She had never seen Hillstrom striving for effect. He did not talk to make an impression. There was a complete absence of pose in him. Ada, too, had been entirely free from that trait. She became absorbed in memories and recollections of her friends, the dead Ada, the restless, roaming Hillstrom. She was wondering how soon he would show up in New York again. She was craving for a talk with him. Such a talk would clear things for her, would bring definiteness into her thoughts. The conversation finally settled upon Russia, Russian men, Russian women, the frank, open way they had of meeting, discussing questionings of love, of sex. It drifted to Russian literature. Villard Spence, the architect, was talking about Turgenev, his heroes, his characters, and Hilda pricked up her ears. She had read every one of the half-dozen volumes of Turgenev which her friend Ada Breen had had. She had read an essay on the writer, on Russian life in general, with which one of the volumes was prefaced. "What troubles me about Turgenev, about his characters," Spence was saying, "is that they are not men of action. They get nowhere. They are noble, they are fine, when they dream, but they are helpless and miserable when they attempt to convert their dreams into reality. They planned to free their country from despotism and autocracy and end by going to seed themselves, while the despotism goes flourishing on. They plan revolution and end with suicide. The best Rudin can do is to throw away his life aimlessly on a barricade in Paris. The nihilist, Bazarov, at the threshold of what should have been a vigorous, active life in behalf of the oppressed Russian people, indifferently, almost willingly, walks into death. And you hold it against them that they dream, but get nowhere? Hilda asked. Yes, the architect replied. What you demand then is that men live up to their dreams, that they put their ideals into practice? Why, yes. Spence was gazing at Hilda uneasily, as one does upon an unknown adversary. Hilda persisted. But suppose action is not possible? Suppose the time is not propitious, not yet ripe for action? I don't know as I follow you, Spence said vaguely. Very well. Let us take the two characters of Turgenev you have mentioned, Rudin and Bazarov, Hilda continued. Who were they? They were two young idealists whose eyes have been opened to certain wrongs and injustices in Russia and their country's life and institutions. They would like to see things different, to change things. But there are few of them. Russia is a country of 160 millions, and these millions are ignorant, inert, blind. What can these few idealists do except talk, agitate, arouse an individual here and there to think as they do? And why talk of Russia? Why not talk about our own country? Hilda's voice rose. We have in this country a capitalist oligarchy that oppresses the American workman the same as Russia's political autocracy oppresses the Russian peasant. And we have men in America, idealists, who see this industrial autocracy, who would like to overthrow it. But these men are as few in America as the Rudins and Bazarovs in their day were in Russia. The mass of the working men in America are as blind to the cause of their oppression as the mass of Russian peasantry was blind to the cause of its oppression. About all our idealists can do for the present is to talk and agitate. Should they be condemned because they merely dream of a better day for the working class of America without being able to usher in that day? I don't think so. I respect anyone who has the courage to dream of a better world. The men of action of tomorrow will derive their strength from the men of dreams of today. You dear, you talk wonderfully. Miss Adams threw her arms about Hilda when she had finished. All the girls crowded about her. Miss Evans was immensely proud of her. Miss Heath wanted to know if she knew personally many such American idealists. It would be nice to invite them to the house sometime. Mr. Carston, the man who was interested in the spreading of manual training among Negroes, did not take his eyes off Hilda the rest of the evening. When she was in her room alone, Hilda thought of what a queer turn her life had taken. What was she doing among these young women? And what were they, these girls from the colleges, doing in New York? What was it missing in their lives that they were seeking to find in the labor movement? What could the labor movement do for them? What could they do for it? In spite of their professions of seriousness, Hilda was finding it impossible to take these girls seriously. There was a lack of conviction in all they said. It was not insincerity. The girls were quite sincere. It was the fact that their grievances were not their own. They were decrying wrongs which they had not themselves suffered. They were denouncing oppressions which they had not experienced. They were not working women. Their revolt came from the brain, not from the heart. Yes, what was she doing among them? The more she viewed her life, the events of the past months, weeks, the more she felt that she was going along an uncharted road. She was thinking over the incidents of the evening. Why had she spoken as she did? Was it because Villard Spence had reminded her so much of Raymond Everett? They did not look alike, but they had so many things in common. In the first place, the two were of the same age. Then there was the same brilliance of expression and the evident lack of strength behind it. That, too, they seemed to have in common. Was it with Raymond, rather than with the architect who she scarcely knew, that she had semi-consciously taken issue that evening? Was it to Raymond that she was trying to show that she had read and understood, that she could explain herself, could defend her views? Was it Raymond? The girls began taking their troubles to Hilda. At first they came for advice. Though she was of an age with most of them, they looked upon her as older. She was more experienced. She had been married, had had a child. Later, they began coming to her for comfort. She had a way of lightening one's burdens with a word, with a look, they found. They were telling her about their families, the beautiful homes they had left to come to New York, the chances for a life of comfort they were fleeing from in order to attain a vague and elusive something which they themselves were unable to define clearly, to picture. Sometimes they called this vague something they were striving after independence. Sometimes they called it feminism. Sometimes they called it freedom. Freedom from restraint, freedom from conventions, freedom from the idleness and uselessness to which women of their class were condemned. Hilda grew sympathetic toward them. They too were traveling along uncharted roads, only their goals were different. It was freedom for herself, personal freedom in some degree, in varying degrees, each of these young women was seeking. It was freedom for all, a free world, Hilda was dreaming of. The girls spoke to Hilda of being hard and uncompromising, of fighting to a finish. She listened to them as a mother listens to a tired, sleepy child babbling things which he will forget in the morning. The problems of some of the girls were real. Others were magnifying into problems trifles such as she, Hilda, would have settled with a thought. Mature women, worldly wise in many ways, they were like children, helpless in some of life's simplest situations. As for the revolutionary propensities of these girls, Hilda had learned to discount them completely. A cup of hot chocolate when they were tired, she noticed, and their mood of revolt, of abandon, would melt away. Miss Heath was voted by the girls as the cleverest and most businesslike among them. Norma had been in New York longer than any of them, nearly 3 years, and had an insight into many of the city's and the country's problems. Also, she had decided opinions on things. She had the reputation of one not afraid to look facts in the face. "I don't know where I'm going, but I'm on my way," she once said to Hilda with a nervous laugh. It was late on a Sunday afternoon, and the two were alone in the house. A snowstorm was howling outside. Little Raymond, after playing for a long time by himself, had fallen asleep. Norma had just finished telling Hilda about her home in Denver. She had shown her a letter from a man there, a banker, who had been after her for 3 years to marry him, but whom she had repeatedly turned down. The world was so full of stirring ideas, of big, beautiful aims, that she could not make up her mind to surrender herself to the sort of an existence which her position as the wife of a banker in a priggish, self-satisfied social circle would call for. The man, she confided, was 12 years older than herself. I don't know as any of us know exactly where we're going, Hilda reflected. It's the age we're living in, the times that make us so. You are such a restful person, Norma said, rubbing her cheek against Hilda's arm. You're so composed and self-reliant. And yet, you don't mind my saying it, you're not materially as well off as any of us. You have no wealthy parents, no family to fall back on. I wonder if it's the baby that gives you so much poise, so much strength. I'm not as contented as I may appear. Hilda's voice was melancholy. But I am composed, I presume. I have learned self-control. Life has knocked it into me. Life. It has been hard at times. Of course, she added, after a silence, a child does make a big change in one, a big change. It must be wonderful to have a child, Miss Heath reflected dreamily. If only the father, the husband, did not go with it. I love children, but I hate the race of husbands, she added bitterly. Miss Heath had turned her eyes away, and Hilda could not see her gaze, but her face was twitching, and Hilda wondered what tragedy in her own life Norma was thinking of. I don't know how it all appears to you, Norma resumed after a little, and her voice rang old and disillusioned. But to me, this life of ours, which most of us pretend is independence, emancipation, this cutting one's hair, this smoking, wearing men's shoes, and here and there even adopting men's standard of morality, or rather immorality, to me all this is a pitiful illusion. It is not freedom. It is not emancipation. It is not even an approach to it. It is only the prisoner beating against his prison door. It isn't defying prejudices and breaking conventions by 100 women or 1,000 or 10,000 that will set woman free, she continued. The independence of woman will not be achieved short of revolution, a revolution in the relations between men and women. Woman will not be free until she has achieved the right to motherhood, until her right to have a child, whether conforming to convention or not, whether in wedlock or out of wedlock, is as unquestioned as her right to live. If this should sound the death knell of the present marriage institution, let it. If the institution of marriage is incompatible with the freedom of woman, let it go down before it. Hilda did not answer. The marriage institution was the one thing she could never bring herself to speak about. Whenever marriage, the family, came under discussion, and it came often, she maintained a shy, depressive silence. Miss Heath took her hand. It was trembling. Hilda was wondering whether the young woman beside her might guess the reason for her silence, for her trembling. Several months later, on an evening in June, Norma came home in the company of a correctly dressed, correct-looking, tall, thinnish man. He was 40 years old. His nondescript hair was thin on the top of his head and gray at the temples. It was the banker from Denver. Norma introduced him as her fiancé. In the presence of this man, the girls dropped their slouchy and somewhat challenging conduct like children in the presence of their school principal or the Sunday school superintendent. They sat straight in their chairs, forgot their cigarettes. Harriet Adams seemed conscious of her bobbed hair, at which the man was gazing with an air that seemed to say, "I reserve decision on this point. I have not had time to make up my mind yet." Miss Heath talked with assumed gaiety, and the girls readily and quite deftly fell into that mood. To Hilda, it seemed as if every one of them had suddenly put on a mask. Sharply, at 10 o'clock, the man took his leave to go to the hotel. Norma went down the stairs with him to the sidewalk. She came up again after a few minutes, went into Hilda's room, and sat down beside her on the bed. Both were silent for some minutes. Suddenly, Norma sought Hilda's hand, took it in her own, patted it, and began speaking in detached, broken phrases. "You were not angry with me after what I've said about marriage, about freedom, to be crawling under the old family blanket of respectability. I have not changed my views. I still believe in those ideas. I do. But I can't fight for them. I was not brought up for sustained work, for drudgery. I must have warmth, comfort." Hilda sat unmoved. Her features were tense. Norma threw her arms about her companion's neck. "Why am I not as strong as you, Hilda?" she wept.